Chapter 4 of A Popular History of Ireland, Book 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leon Meyer. A Popular History of Ireland, from the Earliest Period to the Emancipation of the Catholics, Book 2, by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Chapter 4. Kings of the 10th Century: Nial IV, Donogh II, Congal III, Donald IV. Nial IV, surnamed Blackney, succeeded his father-in-law, Flann of the Shannon, A.D. 916, and in the third year of his reign fell in an assault on Dublin. Donogh II, son of Flann Siona, reigned for 25 years. Congal III succeeded, and was slain in an ambush by the Dublin Danes, in the 12th year of his reign, A.D. 956. Donald IV, in the 24th year of his reign, died at Armagh, A.D. 979. Which 4 reigns bring us to the period of the accession of Malachy II as Ard Rí, and the entrance of Brian Boru on the national stage as King of Cashel, and competitor for the monarchy. The reign of Nial Blackney was too brief to be memorable for any other event than his heroic death in battle. The Danes having recovered Dublin and strengthened its defences, Nial, it is stated, was incited by his confessor, the Abbot of Bangor, to attempt their re-expulsion. Accordingly, in October 919, he marched towards Dublin, with a numerous host. Conor, son of the late king and Roydamna, the lords of Ulidia, Down, Oriel, Louth, Bria, East Meath, and other chiefs, with their clans accompanying him. Sitric and Ivar, sons of the first Danish leaders in Ireland, marched out to meet them, and near Rathfarnham on the Dodder a battle was fought, in which the Irish were utterly defeated and their monarch slain. This Nial left a son named Murkertach, who, according to the compact entered into between the northern and southern Hy Nial, became the Roydamna of the next reign, and the most successful leader against the Danes, since the time of Malachy I. He was the stepson of the poetic Lady Gormley, whose lot it was to have been married in succession to the King of Munster, the King of Leinster, and the monarch. Her first husband was Cormac, son of Cuillenan, before he entered holy orders; her second, Kerball of Leinster, and her third, Nial Blackney. She was an accomplished poetess, besides being the daughter, wife, and mother of kings. Yet after the death of Nial she "begged from door to door," and no one had pity on her fallen state. By what vices she had thus estranged from her every kinsman, and every dependent, we are left to imagine. But that such was her misfortune, at the time her brother was monarch, and her stepson successor, we learn from the annals, which record her penance and death, under the date of 948. The defeat sustained near Rathfarnham by the late king was amply avenged in the first year of the new Ard Rí, A.D. 920, when the Dublin Danes, having marched out, taken and burned Kells, in Meath, were on their return through the plain of Bria, attacked and routed with unprecedented slaughter. There fell on the nobles of the Norsemen there, say the old annalists, as many as fell of the nobles and plebeians of the Irish at Athcliath, Dublin. The northern Hydra, however, was not left headless. Godfrey, grandson of Ivar, and Tomar, son of Algi, took command at Dublin and Limerick, infusing new life into the remnant of their race. The youthful son of the late king, soon after at the head of a strong force, A.D. 921, compelled Godfrey to retreat from Ulster, to his ships, and to return by sea to Dublin. This was Murkertach, fondly called by the elegiac bards the Hector of the West, and for his heroic achievements not undeserving to be named after the gallant defender of Troy. Murkertach first appears in our annals at the year 921, and disappears in the thick of the battle in 938. His whole career covers 17 years. His position throughout was subordinate and expectant. for King Donogh outlived his heir. But there are few names in any age of the history of his country more worthy of historical honour than his. While Donogh was king in name, Murkertach was king in fact. On him devolved the burden of every negotiation, and the brunt of every battle. Unlike his ancestor, Hugh of Aileach, in opposition to Donogh's ancestor, Malachy I, he never attempts to counteract the king, or to harass him in his patrimony. He rather does what is right and needful himself, leaving Donogh to claim the credit, if he be so minded. True, a coolness and a quarrel arises between them, and even a challenge of battle is exchanged, but better counsels prevail, peace is restored, and the king and the Roydamna march as one man against the common enemy. It has been said of another, but not wholly dissimilar form of government, that crown princes are always in opposition. If this saying holds good of father and son, as occupant and expectant of a throne, how much more likely is it to be true of a successor and a principal, chosen from different dynasties, with a view to combine, or at worst to balance, conflicting hereditary interests? In the conduct of Murkertach we admire, in turn, his many shining personal qualities, which even tasteless panegyric cannot hide, and the prudence, self-denial, patience, and perseverance with which he awaits his day of power. Unhappily, for one every way so worthy of it, that day never arrived. At no former period, not even at the height of the tyranny of Turgesius, was a capable prince more needed in Erin. The new generation of Northmen were again upon all the estuaries and inland waters of the island. In the years 923, 924, and 925, their light-armoured vessels swarmed on Loch Earn, Loch Ree, and other lakes, spreading flame and terror on every side. Clonmacnoise and Kildare, slowly recovering from former pillage, were again left empty and in ruins. Murkertach, the base of whose early operations was his own patrimony in Ulster, attacked near Newry a northern division under the command of the son of Godfrey, A.D. 926, and left 800 dead on the field. The escape of the remnant was only secured by Godfrey marching rapidly to their relief and covering the retreat. His son lay with the dead. In the years 933, at Slieve Bema, in his own province, Murkertach won a third victory, and in 936, taking political advantage of the result of the great English battle of Brunanburh, which had so seriously diminished the Danish strength, the Roydamna, in company with the king, assaulted Dublin, expelled its garrison, levelled its fortress, and left the dwellings of the Northmen in ashes. From Dublin they proceeded southward, through Leinster and Munster, and after taking hostages of every tribe, Donogh returned to his Methian home and Murkertach to Aileach. While resting in his own fort, A.D. 939, he was surprised by a party of Danes, and carried off to their ships. But, says the old translator of the Annals of Clonmacnoise, he made a good escape from them, as it was God's will. The following season he redoubled his efforts against the enemy. Attacking them on their own element, he ravaged their settlements on the Scottish coasts, and among the isles of the Insi Gaul, the Hebrides, returned laden with spoils, and hailed with acclamations as the liberator of his people. Of the same age with Murkertach, the reigning prince at Cashel was Kellachan, one of the heroes of the latter bards and storytellers of the south. The romantic tales of his capture by the Danes, and captivity in their fleet at Dundalk, of the love which Sitric's wife bore him, and of his gallant rescue by the Dalcassians and Eugenians, have no historical sanction. He was often both at war and at peace with the foreigners of Cork and Limerick, and did not hesitate more than once to employ their arms for the maintenance of his own supremacy. But his only authentic captivity was, as a hostage, in the hands of Murkertach. While the latter was absent, on his expedition to Insi Gaul, Kellachan fell upon the Deisi and Ossorians, and inflicted severe chastisement upon them, alleging as his provocation that they had given hostages to Murkertach, and acknowledged him as Roydamna of all Erin, in contempt of the co-equal rights of Cashel. When Murkertach returned from his Scotch expedition, and heard what had occurred, and on what pretext Kellachan had acted, he assembled at Aileach all the branches of the northern Hy Nial, for whom this was cause indeed. Out of those he selected 1,000 chosen men, whom he provided, among other equipments, with those leathern coats which lent a sobriquet to his name, and with these 1,000 heroes he set out, strong in his popularity and his alliances, to make a circuit of the entire island, A.D. 940. He departed from Aileach, says his bard, whose itinerary we have, keeping his left hand to the sea. Dublin, once more rebuilt, acknowledged his title, and Sitrick, one of his lords, went with him as hostage for Earl Blacair and his countrymen. Leinster surrendered him Lorcan, its king. Kellachan of Cashel, overawed by his superior fortune, advised his own people not to resist by force, and consented to become himself the hostage for all Munster. In Connaught, Conor, for whom the O'Conors take their family name, son of the prince, came voluntarily to his camp, and was received with open arms. Kellachan alone was submitted to the indignity of wearing a fetter. With these distinguished hostages, Murkertach and his leather-cloaked 1,000 returned to Aileach, where for 5 months they spent a season of unbounded rejoicing. In the following year the Roydamna transferred the hostages to King Donogh, as his suzerain, thus setting the highest example of obedience from the highest place. He might now look abroad over all the tribes of Erin, and feel himself without a rival among his countrymen. He stood at the very summit of his good fortune, when the Danes of Dublin, reinforced from abroad, after his "circuit," renewed their old plundering practices. They marched north, at the close of winter, under Earl Blacair, their destination evidently being Armagh. Murkertach, with some troops hastily collected, disputed their passage at the ford of Ardee. An engagement ensued on Saturday, the 4th of March, 943, in which the noble Roydamna fell. King Donogh, to whose reign his vigorous spirit has given its main historical importance, survived him but a 12-month. The monarch died in the bed of repose, his destined successor in the thick of battle. The death of the brave and beloved Murkertach filled all Erin with grief and rage, and as King Donogh was too old to avenge his destined successor, that duty devolved on Congal, the new Roydamna. In the year after the fatal action at Ardee, Congal, with Bran, king of Leinster, and Kellach, heir of Leinster, assaulted and took Dublin, and wreaked a terrible revenge for the nation's loss. The women, children, and plebeians were carried off captive. The greater part of the garrison were put to the sword. But a portion escaped in their vessels to their fortress on Dockie, an island in the Bay of Dublin. This was the 3rd time within a century that Dublin had been rid of its foreign yoke, and yet, as the Gaelic Irish would not themselves dwell in fortified towns, the site remained open and unoccupied, to be rebuilt as often as it might be retaken. The gallant Congal, the same year, succeeded on the death of Donogh to the sovereignty, and, so soon as he had secured a seat and surrounded it with sufficient hostages, he showed that he could not only avenge the death, but imitate the glorious life of him whose place he held. 2 considerable victories in his 3rd and 4th years increased his fame, and rejoiced the hearts of his countrymen. The first was won at Slane, aided by the Lord of Breffni, O'Rourke, and by Olaf the Crooked, a northern chief. The second was fought at Dublin, 947, in which Blacair, the victor at Ardee, and 1,600 of his men were slain. Thus was the death of Murkertach finally avenged. It is very remarkable that the first conversions to Christianity among the Danes of Dublin should have taken place immediately after these successive defeats in 948. Nor, although quite willing to impute the best and most disinterested motives to these first neophytes, can we shut our eyes to the fact that no change of life, such as we might reasonably look for, accompanied their change of religion. Godfrid, son of Sitric, and successor of Blacair, who professed himself a Christian in 948, plundered and destroyed the churches of East Meath in 949, burnt 150 persons in the oratory of Drumree, and carried off as captives 3,000 persons. If the tree is to be judged by its fruits, this first year's growth of the new faith is rather alarming. It compels us to disbelieve the sincerity of Godfrid, at least, and the fighting men who wrought these outrages and sacrileges. It forces us to rank them with the incorrigible heathens, who boasted that they had 20 times received the sacrament of baptism, and valued it for the 20 white robes which had been presented to them on those occasions. Still, we must endeavour hereafter, when we can, to distinguish Christian from pagan Danes, and those of Irish birth, sons of the first comers, from the foreign-born kinsmen of their ancestors. Between these two classes there grew a gulf of feeling and experience, which a common language and common dangers only partially bridged over. Not seldom the interests and inclinations of the Irish-born Dane, especially if a true Christian, were at open variance with the interests and designs of the new arrivals from Denmark, and it is generally, if not invariably, with the former that the Leinster and other Irish princes enter into coalitions for common political purposes. The remainder of the reign of Congal is one vigorous battle. The Lord of Breffni, who had fought beside him on the hill of Slane, advanced his claim to be recognized Roydamna, and, this being denied, broke out into rebellion and harassed his patrimony. Donald, son of Murkertach and grandson of Nial, the first who took the name of Uai Nial, or O'Neill, disputed these pretensions of the Lord of Breffni, carried his boats overland from Aileach to Loch Earn in Fermanagh, and Loch Otter in Cavan, attacked the Lake Islands, where the treasure and hostages of Breffni were kept, and carried them off to his own fortress. The warlike and indefatigable king was in the field summer and winter, enforcing his authority on Munster and Connaught, and battling with the foreign garrisons between times. No former Ard Righ had a severer struggle with the insubordinate elements which beset him from first to last. His end was sudden, but not inglorious. In returning from the chariot races at Curragh of Kildare, he was surprised and slain in an ambuscade laid for him by Godfrid, at a place on the banks of the Liffey, called Tyraris or Tiraris House. By his side, fighting bravely, fell the lords of Teffia and Ferrard, 2 of his nephews, and others of his personal attendants and companions. The Dublin Danes had in their turn a day of rejoicing and of revenge for the defeats they had suffered at Congal's hands. This reign is not only notable for the imputed first conversion of the Danes to Christianity, but also for the general adoption of family names. Hitherto we have been enabled to distinguish clansmen only by tribe names formed by prefixing High, Kennel, Sill, Munter, Dal, or some synonymous term, meaning race, kindred, sept, district, or part, to the proper name of a remote common ancestor, as High Neil, Kennel Connell, Sill Murray, Munter Iole, Dal Kai, and Dal Riata. But the great tribes now begin to break into families, and we are hereafter to know particular houses by distinct hereditary surnames, as O'Neill, O'Connor, MacMurrough, and McCarthy. Yet the whole body of relatives are often spoken of by the old tribal title, which, unless exceptions are named, is supposed to embrace all the descendants of the old connection to whom it was once common. At first this alternate use of tribe and family names may confuse the reader, for it is rather puzzling to find a MacLachlan with the same paternal ancestor as an O'Neill, and a MacMahon of Thomond as an O'Brien. But the difficulty disappears with use and familiarity, and though the number and variety of newly coined names cannot be at once committed to memory, the story itself gains in distinctness by the change. In the year 955, Donald O'Neill, son of the brave and beloved Murkertach, was recognized as Ard Righ, by the recognized number of provinces, without recourse to coercion. But it was not to be expected that any Ard Righ should, at this period of his country's fortunes, reign long in peace. War was then the business of the king, the first art he had to learn, and the first to practice. Warfare in Ireland had not been a stationary science since the arrival of the Norwegians and their successors, the Danes. Something they may have acquired from the natives, and in turn the natives were not slow to copy whatever seemed most effective in their tactics. Donald IV was the first to imitate their habit of employing armed boats on their inland lakes. He even improved on their example by carrying these boats with him overland, and launching them wherever he needed their cooperation, as we have already seen him do in his expedition against Breffni, while Roydamna, and as we find him doing again in the 7th year of his reign, when he carried his boats overland from Armagh to West Meath, in order to employ them on Loch Ennell, near Mullingar. He was at this time engaged in making his first royal visitation of the provinces, upon which he spent 2 months in Leinster with all his forces, coerced the Munster chiefs by fire and sword into obedience, and severely punished the insubordination of Feargal O'Rourke, King of Connaught. His fleet upon Loch Ennell, and his severities generally while in their patrimony, so exasperated the powerful families of the southern Hy Nial, the elder of which was now known as O'Melaghlin, that on the first opportunity they leagued with the Dublin Danes, under their leader Olaf the Crooked, A.D. 966, and drove King Donald out of Leinster and Meath, pursuing him across Slieve Fuaid, almost to the walls of Aileach. But the brave tribes of Tyrconnell and Tyrrowan rallied to his support, and he pressed south upon the insurgents of Meath and Dublin. Westmeath he rapidly overran, and planted a garrison in every cantred from the Shannon to Kells. In the campaigns which now succeeded each other, without truce or pause, for nearly a dozen years, the Leinster people generally sympathized with and assisted those of Westmeath, and Olaf of Dublin, who recruited his ranks by the junction of the Lachmans, a warlike tribe from Insi Gall, the Hebrides. Ossory, on the other hand, acted with the monarch, and the son of its Tainist, A.D. 974, was slain before Dublin, by Olaf and his Leinster allies, with 2600 men, of Ossory and Ulster. The campaign of 978 was still more eventful. The Leinster men quarrelled with their Danish allies, who had taken their king captive, and in an engagement at Belan near Athy defeated their forces with the loss of the heir of Leinster, the lords of Kinsella, Leah, and Moret, and other chiefs. King Donald had no better fortune at Kilmoon, in Meath, the same season, where he was utterly routed by the same force, with the loss of Ardgall, heir of Ulidia, and Kenneth, lord of Tyrconnell. But for the victories gained about the same period in Munster by Mahone and Brian, the sons of Kennedy, over the Danes of Limerick, of which we shall speak more fully hereafter, the balance of victory would have strongly inclined towards the Northmen at this stage of the contest. A leader, second in fame and in services only to Brian, was now putting forth his energies against the common enemy in Meath. This was Melaghlin, better known afterwards as Malachy II, son of Donald, son of King Dono, and therefore great-grandson to his namesake, Malachy I. He had lately attained to the command of his tribe, and he resolved to earn the honours which were in store for him, as successor to the sovereignty. In the year 979 the Danes of Dublin and the Isles marched in unusual strength into Meath, under the command of Ranald, son of Olaf the Crooked, and Connail, the Orator of Athcliath, Dublin. Malachy, with his allies, gave them battle near Tara, and achieved a complete victory. Earl Ranald and the Orator were left dead on the field, with, it is reported, 5,000 of the foreigners. On the Irish side fell the heir of Leinster, the Lord of Morgallion and his son, the lords of Fertula and Cremorne, and a host of their followers. The engagement, in true Homeric spirit, had been suspended on 3 successive nights, and renewed 3 successive days. It was a genuine pitched battle, a trial of main strength, each party being equally confident of victory. The results were most important and most gratifying to the national pride. Malachy, accompanied by his friend, the Lord of Ulidia, Down, moved rapidly on Dublin, which in its panic yielded to all his demands. The King of Leinster and 2,000 other prisoners were given up to him without ransom. The Danish earls solemnly renounced all claims to tribute or fine from any of the dwellers without their own walls. Malachy remained in the city 3 days, dismantled its fortresses, and carried off its hostages and treasure. The unfortunate Olaf the Crooked fled beyond seas, and died at Iona in exile and a Christian. In the same year, and in the midst of universal rejoicing, Donald IV died peacefully and piously at Armagh, in the 24th year of his reign. He was succeeded by Malachy, who was his sister's son, and in whom all the promise of the lamented Murkertach seemed to revive. The story of Malachy II is so interwoven with the still more illustrious career of Brian Boru that it will not lose in interest by being presented in detail. But before entering on the rivalry of these great men, we must again remark on the altered position which the Northmen of this age hold to the Irish from that which existed formerly. A century and a half had now elapsed since their first settlement in the seaports, especially of the eastern and southern provinces. More than one generation of their descendants had been born on the banks of the Liffey, the Shannon, and the Suir. Many of them had married into Irish families, had learned the language of the country, and embraced its religion. When Limerick was taken by Brian, Ivar, its Danish lord, fled for sanctuary to Scattery Island, and when Dublin was taken by Malachy II, Olaf the Crooked fled to Iona. Intermarriages with the highest Gaelic families became frequent, after their conversion to Christianity. The mother of Malachy, after his father's death, had married Olaf of Dublin, by whom she had a son, named Gluniarran, Iron Knee from his armour, who was thus half-brother to the king. It is natural enough to find him the ally of Malachy, a few years later, against Ivar of Waterford, and curious enough to find Ivar's son called Gilla Patrick, servant of Patrick. Calacan of Cashel had married a Danish, and Sitrick of the Silken Beard, an Irish lady. That all the Northmen were not, even in Ireland, converted in one generation, is evident. Those of Insi Gall were still, perhaps, pagans. Those of Orkneys and of Denmark, who came to the battle of Clontarf in the beginning of the next century, chose to fight on Good Friday, under the advice of their heathen oracles. The first half of the 11th century, the age of St. Olaf and of Canute, is the era of the establishment of Christianity among the Scandinavians, and hence the necessity for distinguishing between those who came to Ireland direct from the Baltic, from those who, born in Ireland and bred up in the Christian faith, had as much to apprehend from such an invasion as the Celts themselves. End of chapter 4.